What's up YouTube? As you know already, I'm a huge fan of grunge poster design work. I love the textures and details of it. And I'm going to show you today that the small changes you can make in your design process can change your overall design completely. So let's jump straight into Photoshop and I'm going to walk you through this poster design. Okay, now moving into Photoshop here, we have the final surge design. Now you wouldn't recognize it straight away, but these effects are primarily made using one small detail. And I'm going to show you as I work through the poster. But you can see I've got these colorways here. I've got this blue option. I've got a red. I've got more of a turquoise blue and then a black and yellow one. Now with these color options applied, the effects are enhanced a lot. Now I'm going to show you how this is achieved, but as I zoom in, there's so many textural details and really small elements. Now the text almost looks layered on top. So we're mixing these kind of ink bleed effects with this distressed text, these kind of paint splats as well. There's a lot of fine details in here and I'm going to show you exactly how I've done them. So let's jump in. Okay, first step as always is going to be creating a new canvas. Now the standard I use for all of my poster design work is 3840 by 4800 pixels with 300 resolution. I'm going to hit OK there. I'll use this command backspace with my background color as black selected. Then I'm going to press D to just reset my colors here. So now first step I'm going to do is going to be creating this kind of skeleton graphic here. So now this like spine. Okay, so I'm just going to paste this spine image in now. And what I want to do is I want to isolate just the bones. I'm going to turn it into a black and white asset. So the first thing I'm going to do to try and isolate these bones is I'm going to open up blending options. So come down to effects and blending options. So now with these sliders, I'm going to hold my option key and I'm going to drag this white value on current layer. I'm going to drag it down. So this is going to hide the white values. And you can see because I split these sliders, it's doing it gradually. If I pull in this slider, it's going to do it a lot quicker. Now I don't really want too many light areas. I kind of want this front portion of the bones to be black, how they are now. So I'm going to say maybe around this level is good for me. Then I'm going to hit OK. Now with this blending option applied, we now need to turn this into its own layer. So I'm going to convert this to a smart object. So now when I use Command T, you can see that this skeleton is now the isolated asset. So from here, I want to turn this into black and white. So I'm going to come up to Filter Gallery, so Filter and then Filter Gallery. And now I already have this applied here, as you can see. But what I'm going to do is come onto this Sketch tab, and I'm going to select Torn Edges. Now, because we're working against a black background with white, we're going to barely be able to see this. But you can kind of see that there's certain areas on here that are turning white, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to use these settings here of a 5, 9, and 20. And I'm going to hit OK. So now with this black and white applied, I'm going to use Command T, and I'm just going to size this down. Kind of down into the center here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a grid system so I can align it better. So I'm going to come up to View, Guides, New Guide Layout. Now I already have my previous one saved. So I'm going to show you here. I've got 10 columns, 4 rows, 50 gutter, 100 pixel margins. I'm going to hit OK here. Now the reason I put in so many columns is because I'm going to be using a lot of type assets that are quite small. So it's just going to give me a lot more options to try and align everything across the work. So I'm just going to resize this slightly. I'm just going to make this slightly smaller. Place this about here. There we go. So now we're just going to move on to the small text. Okay, so moving back over to the reference here, I'm going to show you the type. Now what I've done for this is I've compiled a lot of kind of stats and figures that relate to the theme of electricity. So you can see it's a lot of technical terms here. And I've added some effects on these, but the best thing about it is that they're all live. So if I'm to use the text tool, I can change all of this. So now this is very simply formatted, but I'm going to give you just a quick run through of how I've done this. So if I come back onto the new document, so I've used a script typeface here called Altesse to type the word surge. And now I'm using a mono, really technical looking typeface called Departure. And I'm going to show you how I formatted it here. So using this grid layout we've got, I'm just going to draw in a text box. So let me just hide surge for the moment. Now I'm going to select, I'm actually just going to paste in the text I already have made previously. And then I'm going to show you how I formatted it to look a bit more like this. Now, that's very simple. We're just using tab indents to kind of break it up a little bit. So I'm just going to line up surge with the corner here. And now I'm going to extend this text box to the end of the word surge. And now at the start of each line, I'm just going to use the tab key and then maybe even mix in the space bar. And then I'm going to copy this gap, bring this in slightly, and then I can just Command V to paste this gap in to kind of create these indents. Now for me, this isn't a necessary step. I just like the aesthetic of it. It kind of looks a bit more technical and kind of hacker-esque, which is kind of what I thought fit in really well with the theme. So I'm just going to paste a few of these in, just do them quite randomly, make sure they all kind of line up with this grid. And now for the last 3, I'm just going to paste the same. I've got these 3 asterisks here to kind of signal the end of the line. Repeat the same thing with these. And then now you understand that. I'm just going to paste the rest of the text in for the sake of time, but now you understand how I formatted it. Now you can see that the only type left I add is this small text down here. So I'm just going to repeat the same. I'm just going to copy and paste this in. So I'm just going to line this up where I want on the grid. And in terms of scaling, what I've done is I've used the golden ratio to make this smaller. So I've divided the text of this body by 1.618, and I've done that enough times until I'm happy with the size of it. So now let me just add in the title text now. So now for the title text, I'm using a typeface called Bigger. And you can see here it's a really nice kind of tall, narrow, bold font. I'm just going to align this with the grid lines here. This comes in great contrast-wise against this really small technical-looking type. It really brings your eyes to that for the title. And then this effect I've got going on here is what I've done is I've wrote the title in a script typeface and then I've masked the top half out. So using the same typeface here, so if I just grab this surge box here, I'm going to Command J to duplicate it, and I'm just going to make this bigger. Now, I'm going to place this under, still aligning with this kind of corner grid line here. I'm going to make it slightly outside of the grid, and then I'm going to use my marquee tool. I'm going to highlight under this grid line, and I'm going to hit mask there. I'm going to make sure that this is outside of that text box. So for each kind of body of text you have, so when we come to applying effect, you're going to want to apply different values. So all of the text that is the same size, you want to put that in one group. Everything slightly smaller, put in a different one. And for example, the title and this can be separate. So you can see here how I've got my groups going on. Now the last remaining text you may have noticed is this long error code that we've got going on here. So I'm just going to copy this over into this document. So what I've done is I've used ChatGPT to develop an error code. And then I've used this indentation trick, made a really long text box, and I wanted to make the end of it look like mountain peaks. So I've just adjusted it slightly and taken some chunks out. Now what I'm going to do is use these columns to line them up. So I want them lining up with this text box here. And I'm going to say that about there is good placement for me. Then I'm going to put the opacity down of this to maybe 30 or 40%, just so it's a bit more of a darker grey. I have to add in these small asterisks that I've got going on in the corners. Now again, this is just kind of to support this technical theme. I thought it worked really well in this grid layout. So I'm just going to use this type tool here, and I'm going to use Shift 8 to create this asterisk. Now, immediately I'm just going to convert this to a smart object because I'm not going to be using it for anything else. Then I'm going to use the columns here to create these grid lines. I'm going to put them all in one group and then just duplicate one of them over, drag it over to the other corner. Now for these three slightly bigger ones, again, use the grid lines as a base for this. I'm going to make them slightly bigger and convert that to a smart object. Maybe shrink these slightly. Don't want them too big. Duplicate, drag one over here against this grid line, duplicate, and I'm going to just drag this up slightly. I'm not going to make it exact to the other piece. I'm happy where they are just now. Now, just before we move on to the texture and color, I'm just going to show you this final little detail we've got going on. So we've got this image, which I'm going to show you how to format, and then this huge asterisk behind. And I thought this as a larger asset in this composition looked really good. So I'm just going to use the type tool here, create an asterisk, and I'm going to size this up to as much as I can. And now, once I've got it fully sized, I'm going to bring it into the middle of the page, and then I'm going to convert a smart object so that it doesn't chop the edges off. Then I'm going to use the grid lines to kind of line this up. Yeah, again, I'm not going to try and make this perfect to the other one. Kind of just going to line this up about here. And then I'm going to duplicate this and create a stroke outline. So Command J to duplicate this, and I'm going to turn it 45 degrees. Then I'm going to set the fill to 0, and I'm going to add a stroke. And I'm going to set the stroke at maybe around 2 pixels, and I'm going to leave it on outside. Now I'm going to duplicate this layer, turn it another 45 degrees, and you can see it creates this kind of like abstract pattern. And I think, again, fits really well in with this kind of technical theme. And then I'm going to put all three of these assets into a group. I'm just going to name this large, and I'm going to turn the opacity again to about 30%. So I'm going to move on to this voltmeter image that I've sourced here. Now this looks really nice again, really fits in with the text theme with these kind of like numbered codes. So I'm just going to paste this image in here. So now this is the original. I'm just going to size this down a little bit so that I can begin formatting it. Now first step with this is I want to isolate this blue color and the white in the image. So I'm going to come down to effects and blending options. From here, we're going to use the same method with blend if. I'm going to hold option and I'm going to drag in this dark value. So effectively how this works is if I drag in this dark value to the right, it's going to remove the darker valued colors from the image, and it's going to work the opposite way with the light value colors if I drag this slider in. So I want to remove these dark aspects. So again, I'm going to target the black slider, hold option, and we're going to drag this in. And then I'm going to drag the other one in slightly until it completely removes the background, but doesn't remove any other aspects that I want. So you can see as I drag in this right slider, a bit of texture is being revealed through this area. Now this is perfect, so I'm going to keep dragging this until it's really nice and textured. I'm going to say about there, then I'm going to hit OK. Now that we've blended this, we're going to reconvert this into another smart object. So I don't want to use Command T. This is all that we have. We don't have any other kind of assets poking in through the corners. So now I'm just going to work on placement. So I'm going to use Command T, just size this down. Now, my kind of reference for doing this was I wanted this dial to fit in the asterisk here. So I think this placement's okay. Now you can see from the reference, we just have the dial and this pointer and then the text at the bottom. So what I'm going to do is show you how I've formatted this. So with this placement made, I'm going to use the lasso tool. I'm just going to really vaguely highlight this text and the meter, and then everything outside of it we're going to get rid of. So now I'm going to use Command Option Command Shift and I to invert my selection, and I'm going to hit mask. Now we just need to get rid of this type here. I want to get rid of this General Electric in the volts. So again, I'm going to use the lasso. Now, if you want to do this a bit more precise, you can use the pen tool. But for me, with a lot of the textured elements applied, sometimes the precise mask isn't needed. So again, now I'm going to use Command. I'm going to make sure that black is set as my background color. I'm going to use Command Backspace on the mask to get rid of that. Repeat the same thing here. And now I'm quite happy with the look of this and where it's placed. So now we can move on to the texture and the colored elements. Now moving back over to the reference, undoubtedly my favorite thing about this poster is the kind of layered look of it. So you can see this text almost looks like it's been applied over the top and it's almost hovering by itself, but still has texture applied to it. Now this is a very simple effect that I think can change your grunge poster work a lot. So simply using drop shadows, you can create effects just like this. So first I'm going to be targeting this text area here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this folder. You can see that when I hide it, what is involved. And I'm going to come down to effects. I'm then going to add a drop shadow. Now you can see here, I've got 100% opacity, 0, 0, and 8. I'm going to start the sizing at 8. And then all you have to do with this is you need to duplicate it using the plus icon and then double the value. Now, do this enough times until you feel like you've reached the limit of where you want to move with it. So I'm going to go to 64 here. Then I'm just going to remove these drop shadows off and I'm going to hit OK. So now, even just using this white drop shadow, it's this really simple glow effect that when used with texture and gradient maps translates into so many nice details. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this layer style from the folder and I'm going to start pasting it onto different assets. So for example here, this text is a lot smaller. So I'm just going to remove the bottom drop shadow. I'm just going to hide that on this one. And then I'm going to apply it also to this text here. And you can see here that the opacity has been brought back up. So I'm just going to adjust that back down again. And I'm going to remove my bottom drop shadow there and maybe even one more just so it's a bit more subtle. Now these corner asterisks, I'm just going to do it on this folder again. Paste, remove the bottom drop shadow. On these bigger assets, I'm going to paste and keep them how they are. So I'm going to paste this on the title and the script text as well. The script text is a lot thinner, so I'm going to reduce it slightly, take that bottom drop shadow off. Now the main surge text is I might just keep this on as it's nice and bold and glowing. And I'm also not going to forget to apply it to this large asset up here. So this folder, same step, paste the layer style, drop the opacity back down. And you know, even now that it's a much lower opacity, you can still see this really subtle glow around the outside. Okay, now with these layer modes applied, I'm just going to add in this first small asset before I go onto the texture files. So you can see on this original, I've got these kind of splats going across the piece. Now they're really small on this title text here, and you can see them in this corner. Now to do this, all I've done is I've created a blank layer above the remaining assets, and I've got my brush. Now with my brush, I have this kind of preset here, which I believe is accessible to everyone in Photoshop by default. But what I've done is I've selected this kind of splat. You can see the look of this brush here, and I'm just going to set my brush color to white. Now I've just gone over some certain areas and I've just clicked, and every time you click it produces a random pattern. So you can just click it, undo until you get one pattern that you like. So I'm going to be happy with that just there. Then add one in the corner up here. I'm now going to change my brush to black and I'm going to apply this over the surge text. So again, same step, just click undo until it's a pattern that you're happy with. So I'm happy with that there. Then I'm just going to drop the opacity of this layer maybe to about 80, maybe even slightly lower to 60. There we go. Now let's move on to the texture files and the color. Okay, so I'm just going to add in our first texture layer here, which is going to be this grungy photocopy texture layer. Now the majority of these I'm going to use are free from Texture Fabric, so I'm going to set a link in the description for where you can get these from. Now this one I'm going to keep quite small and I want to apply it just over the title here. So I'm going to set the layer mode to overlay and I'm just going to resize this just so it's kind of covering the title. Now immediately it's not going to look like it's doing too much, and also you can see this white line here, so let me just select a mask. I'm going to use a black brush. I'm going to make sure it's set back to a soft brush. Make sure that black is my foreground color. I'm just going to brush that out. See now, to actually adjust this into the text, I'm going to use the levels tab. So if you've seen my previous video, you know that levels is a really great tool when you're working with textures. So with this texture layer selected, I'm going to use Command L, and this brings up the level sliders. So now from here, you can adjust contrast and brightness to reveal and hide certain areas of the texture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this mid-tone slider towards the darks, and you can see it's kind of really brightening the text here and bringing out this kind of texture detail. If I then bring the dark in, it's repeating the same kind of step with the dark values. So I'm just going to play around with this until I get it kind of where I want it. I'm going to say about here is good for the moment, and then I'm kind of just going to brush this area out so it's a little bit less inconsistent. And now with this layer, I'm also going to duplicate it, and I'm going to change the layer mode to hard light, because you can see here it's kind of only applying to the color around the outside, this glow, but I want it to apply also just over the text itself. So with hard light, this is going to attack all the colors. Now I'm just going to remove these level sliders from the hard light layer, Again, I'm just going to repeat the masking steps where I'm just going to brush out these white lines. Then I'm going to open the levels tab again with Command L, and I'm just going to adjust this. So now bringing the dark in will really increase the contrast on the text. Then I'm going to drag the midtones out, but I want it balanced so that it's not revealed too much on the outside of the text. So I'm going to keep that. I'm going to bring the dark layer in a bit. So now from here, I think this is about good for me. Now you can see it's kind of not really blending well into the corners. So again, I'm just going to do some really subtle masking. Once I apply a gradient map over this, it's going to be slightly less visible. But you can see here, just using a light brush, now the texture over this text is really fine and detailed, and it's coming together. So let's move on to the next layer. Now with this next layer, we're going to be targeting this kind of bottom half down here. Now you can see these really grungy lines going across, complemented by these splats, and the texture within is really nice and inconsistent. So let me just show you the texture layer I've used for this. So let me just paste it into this document. Now if I just resize this to be full screen, you can see it's another photocopy texture, and it's got these really fine grungy details. So I'm just going to rotate this 90 degrees, and I'm going to set the layer mode to screen. Now, my first instinct with this was to use my transform tools and just make this full screen. The only issue I found when doing this is that, you know, it creates some really nice texture details, but because it's a lot bigger, you lose a lot of resolution. So what I've done is I've just placed this along the bottom bit, brought this down. I've just shrunk this a fair amount. I'm going to place it just where I want it here. So I'm going to say about there is good. And now with this applied on screen, I'm just going to drop the opacity a little bit, maybe to about 80. And then I think I'm happy with the levels of where it is now, but I'm going to open the tab up just to see if I can make any changes. So Command L, play around with these values again. I might bring the midtone slider in slightly so it's a little bit more of a gray look, and then bring in the light slider so it's a bit more contrast. So I think there's about good. And now I'm going to duplicate this and I'm going to flip it and just place this on the top half. Now immediately this is not blended well, so let's just work on that. I'm just going to make this one slightly bigger, and I'm going to overlap this so that I can scrub them both. But in terms of texture on this top half now, this almost like fabric looking texture. So now I'm just going to hide the top layer for the moment, and I'm going to add a mask to the initial layer we put on. Now using a black brush, I'm just going to make this slightly bigger. I'm just going to hold shift and go across this. Now, it doesn't need to be difficult, this masking. I'm going to repeat the same step with this one. And there we go, almost immediately blended somewhat seamlessly just with a simple swipe. So now with these textures applied, I'm just going to highlight these, and I'm going to use Command G to put these in a folder. Just name it texture. Now this next texture is going to be a bit more of like a water damage looking one. It's going to have a lot more detail in it, you know, so I'm going to set this full screen how it is now, and I'm going to set the layer mode to screen. Now, almost immediately, you know, it brings through some really cool details, but because it's so present, I'm going to reverse this and then just paint in the areas I actually want viewed. So I'm going to apply a layer mask with this, and I'm going to use Command I to invert the layer mask to make it all not visible. Then using my white brush, so I'm going to use X to make sure the white is my foreground color. I'm going to make this slightly bigger, and I'm just going to tap in, or just really subtly paint in the areas that I want visible with texture. Now again, this one is a lot more trial and error. You can just tap something in. If you don't like it, Command Z, undo it, bring it back in where you want. So I kind of want it a bit inconsistent across the page, you know, so it's not always applied. Now I have a feeling that this texture already has a levels applied to it from the other piece. Yeah, it does. So I'm just going to clear that. And you can see already from clearing it and what I've adjusted before, it makes a huge difference. So I'm just going to show you how I've done that. So Command L, I'm going to drag in this dark value, bring the midtones maybe even further away. You know, just play around with these values for a little bit. Now I want enough texture showing through, but I don't want it kind of overlapping everything. So I'm going to say about there's good, and then hit OK. Now just continue with your drawing, you know, just with a soft brush. And then I think I'm also going to drop the opacity of this layer overall to about 50. There we go. Now with all of these texture layers applied, we can move on to color. Now when we add color, you can choose to do it before or after you do texture. I'm only going to do it after, but we may have to make some adjustments to actually work with the gradient map. So with this texture layer selected, or the texture group selected so that I can add the gradient map over it, I'm going to come down to adjustments and add gradient map. I'm going to select this slider, and I have some presets saved, and I'm just going to work through these presets until I find something that is a little bit up my alley. Now I've got so many options here, so you know, you could be scrolling through this endlessly. Like I even think something like this just looks cool. It's a bit ridiculous, like you could probably work something into it, but you can find so many options that you would never expect with colors with this. But for the moment I'm going to drag down, and I have this preset here. And you can see it's really simple. So what I've done is just a kind of like a mid-ish gray value as the far end, and then a kind of pale blue moving into a bit more of a pale white. Now you can see this piece is just coming together really well. What we're now going to move on to is just adding an overall noise overlay. Now this is going to bring out so much detail in it from everything. Noise works really well with these gradient effects. So above the gradient map, I'm going to come down to adjustments, and I'm going to hit solid color. Now in this hex code range, I'm going to type 80, 80, 80 as a 50% gray. Then I'm going to come up to filter and camera raw filter. Make sure this is converted to a smart object. Now on this effects panel on the right hand side, I'm going to drop down and you're going to see this grain at the bottom. Hit this drop down menu here and I'm going to drag this grain up to 100 and the roughness up to 100. Now you can adjust the size. This is really versatile, this effect, which is great. I'm going to keep it around 20 for me and I'm going to hit OK. Now with this, you can simply just hit the layer mode as overlay. And then if I hide and reveal this layer, so much more detail that gets brought out just by using this noise overlay. And it really ties everything together cohesively. Now, if I was to look at the original, it looks slightly more saturated in terms of color. And this text here looks a bit darker. But the great thing about this is because it's all adjustable, you can simply use the type to identify the layer. And now you can see on this text folder here, we've got the effects. So I've got these drop shadows and you can play with these values to adjust it exactly how you want it. So now I can see I can add in a few more if I want. I could take some out and it's just endless how much customization you have with this. So just play around, get it to the levels that you want it at. It's all trial and error, and the more time you spend on it, the more accurate you're going to get to how you like it. But this is the final piece. And now if you wanted to change the color, simply duplicate the gradient map, come onto this selector. You can even just reverse it for an inverted selection and you can just run through colors, adjust them how you like, and there is just endless options of what you can get. But for now, that is us done. YouTube, as always, thank you very much for watching until the end of the video. I hope it can be useful to you in one way or another. If you want to see more content like this, subscribe for more, make sure the bell is hit, and I'll see you again in the next one.